As political developments and the spread of capital and technology empower Southern Atlantic societies, South Africa, Brazil, and Mexico, among others, are looking for new venues of influence through the Atlantic highways. What are the political and economic implications of a more global Atlantic? Are new trends strengthening cooperation or creating conditions for future conflicts?
I have to say it is a total privilege to be here hosting a panel. I was in Rabat, Morocco. That was my first experience with the German Marshall Fund, and I am thrilled to be back here today with such an esteemed group of panelists, and especially to be moderating the final panel of the Brussels Forum. We are talking, of course, about a fragile world, but mostly we are here to see, to witness, to be inspired by the commitment of all of you who are committed to nurturing this fragile world and figuring out how to heal it in the broken places. On this panel, we're going to be talking about challenges, and I hope you will also help us talk about meaningful solutions before we part today. I know that journalists often get accused of foregoing issues of nuance and focusing on black and white and things that are too practical. I intend to do just that, and I hope that you'll join me. Forgive me and then join me. And I'm going to be coming to you fairly soon for questions. So please think of questions. Please keep them very short and address them to any of the panelists who you wish. And I've invited the panelists to also respond to each other. So for our esteemed panel, first, starting from the far left here is Victor Borges. He is from Cape Verde, Africa, president of the Foundation for Development and International Exchanges. And then next to him is Dr. Jorge Castaneda, professor at New York University. He is originally from Mexico, but now in that little land above the border, and he gets voted best socks of the forum. From Brazil, the honorary Tatiana Prazeres, who is the Secretary of Foreign Trade and at the Ministry of Development, Industry, and Foreign Trade. And then on the far right from China, Dr. Shi Yin-hong, Professor of International Relations and Director of the Center on American Studies at Renmin University of China. Okay, and as you probably know by now, there are many people who are joining us on the web live. So for those listening on the web, the new actors who we are speaking about as we talk about new actors in an old sea, the old sea, of course, being the Atlantic, they are not new countries, but they are newly energized countries, in some cases quite literally energized. Brazil, Mexico, some of the countries of Africa, and countries that have growing influence in transatlantic affairs, including China and India and beyond. Tatiana, I would love to begin with you first. What is your characterization of where Brazil sits on the international stage right now? Because from most accounts, it's sitting pretty. What do you say?
Well, Brazil is willing to play an even more important role in the international scenario, and we're confident that we can contribute positively to the road's prosperity, increased democracy, to the road's security. We know that it entails responsibility. We're doing our part.
And there are many factors to that, and you're going to be talking about them as well. It's kind of a multi-layered situation, and I hope that many people will respond to Brazil's posture in terms of transatlantic affairs as we go on. Jorge Castaneda, through your American-based lens now, talk about whether you see America on the decline, whether you see Europe on the decline, and what the current state of affairs means for Mexico and Latin America as they're on the ascent.
Well, I certainly don't think the United States is on the decline. If they were, they couldn't make socks like these. So,
Are you sure they were made in America?
Absolutely. Paul Smith. But that said, I think that American design, American imagination, innovation, and cultural and ideological hegemony, I think, is still the proper word, is more reality than ever before. That doesn't mean that there aren't new actors in individual aspects. Clearly, China has plays an immense economic role today in the world. Because of sheer population, India has an extraordinarily important role to play. Brazil in the Western Hemisphere has also a very enormous impact. But this notion of American decline, if you look at it a little more objectively and beyond the newspaper headlines, in tribute to what you said about journalism, Lisa, I think that there is less decline there than meets the eye.
And what about Mexico on the rise, on the ascent?
Well, I think we're doing about as well as we did before. Someone said a few weeks ago in Mexico with a group of friends from the German Marshall Fund who visited us, when Brazil was doing great and we were doing lousy, where we're growing at 3%. Now that Brazil is doing lousy and we're doing great, we're growing at 3%. I think that's a fair appraisal of it.
I think there might be other people representing Mexico here or from Latin America who might disagree with that, and I would love to hear from them.
I'd love to hear from them.
Yes, excellent. Okay, Dr. Yin Hong, where does China sit on the international stage? Because we know, for one thing, it takes up a lot of space.
I think that especially in recent years, and everyone says that China is everywhere. China is sitting every chair. I don't think so. And of course, China's overseas presence is mainly most prominently and most widely in economic front. And we have economic presence and newly establishing in Africa, Latin America, Middle East, Central Asia, and so and so. And but diplomatically also, and because China is a big country, because China is a permanent member of Security Council of United Nations, maybe our diplomatic representatives are all around the world. But strategically, I think that China still, and if you take a global perspective, very modest, very the prudent and the low-profile player. I don't think that China have any strategic presence in Latin America, for example. And China have absolutely no strategic presence, strictly speaking, in Africa, and not in almost the Indian Ocean. And what China and strategic concern with is only in East Asia and around our periphery, of course, and we also have some a limited strategic concern and in our the border and with our great friend India, and also in something in Central Asia. But generally, I think that if you take a global picture, China definitely is not a strategic guy, but we are economic and diplomatic guy. Maybe economically, I think that this is the greatest China national achievements since Deng Xiaoping's great reform and opening up, and finally, and maybe a little too much, but roughly speaking, now everywhere is made in China and everywhere is Chinese.
Yeah, didn't we hear in one of the earlier sessions on China that the new president is saying we do not, we intend to move forward, but incrementally. So you're saying that China does not have strategic designs on other partners, including Africa, in terms of asserting itself hegemonically. You're saying that doesn't exist.
I think that strategy is some magic word. Strategy is a magic word. Sometimes you define them very broadly, and I think that China maybe have a very broad, strategic interest. But if you define it as, in its strict meaning and relating to military, I think that I can very confidently say that at least in the next 5 years, even perhaps in the next 10 years, I don't think that China will have any strategic, presence, strategic, the basis, or strictly defined in distant continents.
Okay, one of the things that I learned talking with so many of you throughout this conference is that you can get multipolar opinions, that I would talk to one person who was very vociferous about what he or she was saying, and then I find somebody else who is equally vociferous in the opposite direction. I'd like to turn it over to the audience right now, and perhaps if there's anyone who, why don't we start, do you want to start with China? Is that your main point? If we can get a microphone right here. Is anyone who disagrees with that right now, and then we'll move on to the other regions as well.
Yes, my name is Emil Maiberg. I'm an attorney from Johannesburg. First of all, I must just make a comment that I don't see any South African on this panel, which I find a bit funny. But having said that, Professor, I honestly cannot agree that China, or understand how China can say that it has no strategic interests in Africa. Could you please explain that? Because, and I've asked this question to you in Rabat, China's activities in Africa is causing resentment towards other investors going into Africa because China is not creating jobs for Africans.
answer?
Yes, you can go ahead.
I think that, of course, and I said that China will not have strategic presence in distant continents. And strictly speaking, and military, Chinese soldiers never send there except as, UN peacekeeping troops under Security Council's mandate. And of course, and China search for minerals, gas, oil, for example, in Africa, and these are, have a strategic meaning. But generally, direct motivation is not strategic. It is economic deployment. You shall shake off your hands. And I think that you can provide evidence. What is China's, strictly speaking, strategic presence in Africa?
So this raises the question of you say Chinese, bringing in Chinese instead of Africans in its African investments. And of course, we know that much of this is based on domestic economics. You're disagreeing with that? Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes, and then we'll go to Victor Borges right afterwards.
Peter Kellner from YouGov polling
Sorry,
company.
give me your name once again.
My name's Peter Kellner. I run a polling company in Britain called YouGov. But my question is this. We've heard about employment of Africans. Let me raise two other equivalent issues that a lot of Western governments and agencies feel concern about things like human rights in African countries and the environmental impact of development. It strikes me that China has made inroads into Africa by not worrying about either environmental or human rights issues. So two related questions. Do you see the time coming in the near future when China will be as concerned with these issues as Western agencies are? Meanwhile, do you think we're idiots for considering these issues when you can ride in, not worry about them, and do a lot more business?
And I think that the Chinese government never, not worry about the local conditions in Africa, including some human rights violations, some corruption, but Chinese government really, and according to our own principle, not publicly declare it. Sometimes behind the door, and even in government-to-government diplomatic dialogues, China talk with some, African governments where China have investments, even have diplomatic interests, and we advise them, maybe, perhaps, should do things in this way and not necessarily in that way. But I don't think that China have rights and have self-confidence and have experience, should, in frequent cases to impose our will upon them. Of course, on the other hand, China is a newcomer. And I think that before 20th century, China exactly, and have not any contact with Atlantic, countries. So China is a newcomer, and China have shortcomings. But we are learn something. But one thing is certain, and we don't think that we are in a position to impose some even suggesting advice upon local people, local governments. And of course, China is a security member, a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, China, and sometimes China veto some resolution, but sometimes China vote yes for some resolution, which this resolution have some meaning to improve social and political situation in some African countries.
Victor Borges from Cape Verde, you want to comment?
Thank you, Lisa. I want to say, first of all, that I'm not speaking on behalf of African countries. I'm speaking on my own name, because anytime I speak, people tend to associate my thoughts to African countries. That's not the case. I will comment on what the question of my friend from South Africa and the response of Professor. Well, perhaps China do not have a strategic paper, but it acts strategically. You have a lot of people in the world that perhaps do not know the word strategy, and yet they act strategically.
Is that necessarily a bad thing? I mean, shouldn't it have a strategy?
I'm not judging. I'm just trying to make it comprehensible for me. And you have people speaking all the time, because it's fashionable to use the word strategy, that never acts in a strategic way. So we must, and I don't want to make a debate on semantics, but in my view, and observing China presence in Africa, I believe that somehow there are elements of strategy for trade, for investment, and I also believe that when you have trade, investment, this can be translated in political and security issues, and this we cannot deny.
Okay, yeah, actually, I do want you to go on just very briefly on the end. I mean, yeah, so your take is that the aims in these Chinese investments are good or not, deleterious or not?
You know, I don't want to judge. What I think is that China's presence in Africa is not a bad thing. And it is an opportunity for African countries to diversify their partnership. When you listen to people from the United States and Europe, they are concerned about China's presence in Africa. And I'm not judging, but for African countries, it's an opportunity to diversify. And European and United States are challenged to find a new way of dealing with African countries in terms of development, because development is the main challenge for Africa. Let me give you one example. After having a good idea for a project with the World Bank, and managing the project cycle from identification, preparation, evaluation, etc., till the moment of starting the implementation, you need to count on 4 or 5 years sometimes. And because there is a lot of procedures, a lot of rules. And for African countries that are in need of infrastructure for their own development, this new approach can represent a lot of advantage. This said, I believe that African countries, but also China, Brazil, Mexico, and the United States and Europe must assess the past experience of their relationship. And I'm not so sure that we did a good assessment. Most of the time, we hear people expressing political emotion or judgment. It was good and it was not good, but judgments are not evaluation or assessment.
Yes, okay. So aside from just denigrating, figuring out what went wrong and what can be changed, you're saying? Tatiana, you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I'd just like to build on that to say that for Brazilians, it's quite clear what is the Chinese strategy in terms of trade and investment in Brazil. At first, Chinese were interested in natural resources, a lot of investment in the oil sector, in the mining sector, strategic minerals. Then more recently, Chinese were interested in Brazil's internal market. By 2020, Brazil should be the 4th largest consumer market in the world, and Chinese quickly realized that, so they're investing in Brazil in areas such as the automotive sector or telecommunications sector. This is fine. I mean, we're just trying to identify where our interests meet. But it's clear for us, for Brazilian generally speaking, that Chinese have a strategic approach towards Brazil.
Thank you, Jorge Castaneda.
I rarely agree with my Chinese friends, but on this occasion, I do. I think the point that the professor is making is a very well-made point. In the long term, it is possible that these very narrow, specific economic interests in Latin America and in Africa will require a broader strategic Chinese projection, military, ideological, cultural, political, in the long term. Today, they don't. There are those people who think that this is inevitable. But today, it's not only a question of them not wanting to. China does not have the capability of that type of projection. It does not have a military projection capability. It does not have any cultural projection capability, and it has very little ideological projection capability.
Can you define that, projection capability?
Yeah, you guys should do what we do. That's, call it ideological capability. What the Americans have been doing for about 150 years, that. What you guys should do is what we do, okay? We have the best system in the world, the best political system, the best economic system, the best every system. Everybody in the world should be like the Americans. That's what the Americans say. The Chinese don't say that. They don't say, we don't care what you guys do. This is what we do, and you guys can go and do whatever the hell you want, even wear socks of a different color.
Yes.
I think that I have a little disagreement with you, and the
He was
problem
just
is
agreeing
not,
with you.
problem is not capability. I think that if China have intention, have motivation, and China will send some, at least, military soldiers, or some military advisors, or even occasionally some fleet. But the problem is that, the Chinese advantage is that, at this stage of history, China really have no intention to do things unilaterally and militarily in distant continent. Of course, I don't say that there's no possibility in the future, middle-term future, long-term future, China will not do something just like gunboat, diplomacy. And China also have a possibility, go so-called imperialist road. We are in ancient times, thousands of years Chinese empire. But the Chinese, in this stage of history, and leaders and elites, and remind ourselves. You look at the fate of empire, and the cost, failure, and so we should be careful. So in this stage of history, our strategic plan in Brazil, in Africa, in Latin America, all general strategic plan for investment and trade and so and so. But of course, some things are in gray area, and some minerals and oil and gas have strategic values. But in this stage of history, and why China go to this continent to search for oil and gas and mineral? Because domestic economic imperative. It might lead us go to so-called expansion and military even. But at this stage of history, and China still determined not going this way.
Let me ask you, actually, if you don't mind, Victor, if I ask you from a different, from a different path, and that is, if we look at Africa, is it necessarily the recipient of investment from China and elsewhere, and is it ever going to become the driver when we talk about Africa's emergence as a continent, obviously with all the disparities in Africa? I spoke to the gentleman who was here from Senegal earlier. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here, but he said there is no way, with all the problems that we have in Africa, from food supply to corruption to conflict, that we could be the driver at this point, and I am totally paraphrasing him. But what about Africa not just as the recipient?
This is the huge challenge for African leadership. And most of times, because of lack of leadership, African countries do not develop their own perspective of relationship with the world, with China, with Brazil, etc., and they just follow the perspective of partners countries. And the big challenge for Africa, for me, is to develop their own strategy to deal with those partners. But in doing so, you have the problem of leadership, capacities that sometimes do not exist. You can have elected government, but elected government does not mean that you have democratic governance, that you have government committed to development. And if Africa, and we are not far away from 2015, and it's a sad thing to see that most of African countries are not going to meet the Millennium Development Goals. So, in a situation of lack of development, with a lack of human capacity and leadership, it is very difficult to manage this relationship with China, but also with the United States, with Europe, etc., etc. And this is the huge challenge, in my view, for Africa. It is capacity building to deal with this complex issue and have their own perspective and not adopting the perspective of partners.
To establish its own projection capabilities then. But doesn't that leave a huge void? If it's dealing with its own problems and doesn't have the ability then to have its own strategy and own projections?
Some countries have. When you go to South Africa, you see that there is strategy, and South Africa is in a pivotal situation because it's Indian Ocean, it's Atlantic, and there is this partnership between South Africa, India, and Brazil. And South Africa is in a situation that can play a positive role in this relationship between Africa and Europe, China, and the United States. But South Africa also needs to achieve a lot of internal goals, as much social peace, less socioeconomic decalage, and there is a lot of challenge. You have Angola that can play a very important role, Nigeria, etc., etc.
I wonder if, excuse me, Carrie McNamara is here. Are you Carrie, possibly? Yes. Do you mind if I call on you? You're being called on right now. You gave some interesting figures last night at the dinner where we were appropriately over dinner talking about food and food security issues. I wonder if you can repeat those with regard to Africa, because one of the things that you said was that African farmers, small farmers being those who provide most of the food for Africa, are the solution, not the problem. The problem is not capacity. The problem is being able to get things, for instance, to market. And again, I don't mean to oversimplify what you're saying, but you had some very interesting figures. Could you tell us about them?
Yeah, well, it's it's well known that African agriculture has much lower yields than agriculture in most other areas. And it's known that there are a variety of reasons for that, only one of which is very low use of fertilizer compared to other continents. But what I was saying last night is that when you look at Africa's enormous opportunity for being a driver of food security going forward, it's a very complex problem that has to be addressed in all its complexity. It's not enough just to have smallholder farmers produce more crop on their land, increase their yields, as we say. Because if they can't get that crop, that larger crop to market and get a good price for it, they're not going to increase their yield. They're smart people, they're survivors, especially if they have to buy several months in advance the inputs that would make possible those greater yields. So it's not just increasing yields, which is a thing we hear about a lot. It's infrastructure, it's market linkages, it's helping smallholder farmers become more organized so that they can have more market power. And it's creating the entire link between the farmer and national and global markets. The reason I emphasize smallholders is that, tragically, the international community and African governments badly neglected, underinvested, disinvested in agriculture in Africa for over 20 years, and they're finally coming around just in the last few years. And the reason that smallholder farming is important in Africa is because, as we've seen in too many other places, if you strip out the rural areas of large countries, what you end up with is populations that are largely concentrated in cities where a lot of them don't have jobs. And so developing smallholder agriculture in Africa is not only about answering food security, it's not only about using agriculture as an engine of broader economic growth, inclusive economic growth in African countries. It's also fundamentally about stability, because it's about creating rural livelihoods and rural economies that are sustainable.
I wonder if we can move to Tatiana in terms of the agricultural boom that's happening throughout South America, but particularly in Brazil, and to what extent that influences right now Brazil's stability and Brazil's abilities on the new stage in the Atlantic.
Sure. Well, Brazil has invested hugely in research and development in the agricultural sector, and we are very competitive in different agricultural products. For example, soy and corn. Brazil will, last year we reached record highs of exports in soy and corn as well, but of course we export different kinds of products and, well, ethanol, just to get to the energy sector as well. We have infrastructure problems. We're addressing those problems. We have just launched a plan to attract private investment for ports and railroads in Brazil. This is very important to improve even further our competitiveness in that area. We're very proud of what we've been able to build in the agricultural sector.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at the larger picture of Brazil right now, let's talk a little bit about ambitions. I mean, we're talking about Chinese ambitions, getting different opinions on that. What does Brazil want in terms of its place on the international stage? You focus primarily on economics, on trade, I understand. So take it from that perspective. And then also if others want to express perhaps their own interests on this or concerns as well. But you start off, Tatiana.
Thanks, Lisa. Let me further focus on the economic aspect, maybe trade aspect of that. Yesterday, I listened with a lot of interest to the U.S. And the European Union dialogue, discussions about a possible trade and investment agreement. And there was a lot of discussions about ambitions, about how ambitious such an agreement would be. And I asked myself if that would be the most ambitious approach towards trade. And definitely there would be not. There would be not in case this venue is at the expense of the efforts in the multilateral trade system, at the expense of a broader, comprehensive, and non-discriminatory trade liberalization. Some would say, and I'm not quoting anyone here, that maybe if the European Union and the US would get together and define common standards, unified regulations, etc., and then get back to the WTO members and say, well, here's what we have. Maybe if you want, you can join us. That would sound very, very ambitious. But I tell you, that wouldn't work in today's reality. That narrative somehow reminds me of the 1992 Blair House Agreement, where the US and the European Union sat together and finished and closed the unfinished business of the then Uruguay round. That, on that occasion, paved the way for the conclusion of the Uruguay round that comprised 123 members. Mm-hmm. That wouldn't work today. Mm-hmm. That wouldn't work today for many reasons, one of them being Brazil is more important, India is more important in multilateral matters. The BRICS that didn't exist then now bring to the WTO not only Russia, but China mainly. They were not part of the game on that occasion. Well, there are so many aspects that, would prevent that narrative to happen again. And it's important for us to be aware of the consequences of creating a gap that probably wouldn't be breached again. And the results of that. The result of that, creating a gap, not being able to get back to the multilateral track, would result in a multilateral system limited to maybe a trade court that would judge our policies, everyone's policies, against rules that were defined. In the best scenario in early, mid-90s, the worst scenario in 1947. Mm-hmm. I think it's not very ambitious to get to that kind of result. This is something very important to have in mind.
How about, excuse me, I have some comments over here on I think on Brazil's ambitions? Oh, whatever, go ahead. Can you identify yourself?
No official honor. I just wrapped up my Erasmus fellowship with the GMF, and I teach international relations in Istanbul, Turkey. I want to pick up on this theme of African and extra-African actors' ambitions vis-a-vis the continent, because we've heard China's role downplayed, and maybe it's a question of Asian modesty, but from a Turkish perspective. Okay.
Chinese people are not calculated by modesty. This is fact.
From a nor are Turkish people. And so when one is based in Istanbul, one hears a lot about Turkey's ever more proactive Africa policy. And this may be a response to having been burned in Syria, but you have the Turkish Foreign Ministry opening up 15 new embassies this year. You have the Turkish Development Agency increasing aid to over 100 million, which is still paltry, but it's there. You have Turkish faith-based organizations opening schools across the continent in very hard-to-reach areas. They're performing 60,000 cataract operations for free alone in East Africa alone. You have the Turkish Prime Minister going on several whirlwind tours and making these the centerpiece of his UN speeches in a clear attempt to amplify an African presence into sort of a global governance role. And so my question is, when one listens to discussion of this in Turkey, one would think that Turkey is all over Africa and everyone is aware of this. And are the Chinese and are the Brazilians and are the South Africans aware of this Turkish presence and ambition? And if so, is our interests convergent, or are there clashing interests at play?
Sure.
I think that in China and the government and especially internet scholars in most recent years and began very keenly to aware a new phenomenon in world political economy, especially in world politics, and that's Turkey. And we know that Turkey is very, aspiring, and sometimes is ambitious. And Turkey's active, the performance and in the international stage, and is almost in recent years dramatically increased and expanded. And we welcome this. But also, and I think that Turkey is just like China. And we are newcomers. Sometimes we could have mistakes. Sometimes we could have, to raise, unreasonable, in our eyes and others, complaints or something just like that. So I think that we expected. And next stage of world politics is the age of rising powers. And Indians, Chinese, Brazils, Turkeys, and other countries. I think that the really and 21st century will increase and people and nations' voice and even participation of decision and whose the political and economic rule in the modern world and before today is quite low and underestimated.
Victor, I know you want to respond.
Just to react to this intervention about Turkey, yes, we speak about Brazil, about China and India, but there are a lot of new actors in Africa, in Southern Atlantic, and Turkey, it has been noticed, and Turkey has been very, very aggressive in showing presence in Africa, and Turkey fight a lot to have a lot of United Nations conference on Africa in Istanbul, and the last huge conference on less developed country was held in Istanbul. So it's Turkey, but it's Japan also, it's South Korea. You have a lot of countries trying to play a role in Africa, which is a huge challenge for African governments and African leadership, how to manage this diversity of partners and not being eaten away. Just a last comment for this issue of food security that I think is related to the issue of development. It's true that Africa has this huge challenge of valuing agriculture as an economic solution for its development. The problem is that during 80s, 70s, in spite of a man that I think I should mention, it was Jack Juf, the former Director General of FAO, that advocate a lot for agriculture, but the problem we have now is that there is this investment, but there is also a mindset in African leadership, in the youth, that agriculture is not modernity, that agriculture is synonymous of poverty. So the challenge is investing much more money to agriculture, supporting the small farmers, but also changing mindset of youth to make them make peace with agriculture as a good solution for development, for food security, and for employment.
Ragida wants to speak.
I'm just about the BRICS diplomatic positions taken at the Security Council. Brazil, in particular, probably was after the permanent seat in the Security Council as their speaker of reform. So maybe that drove the positions. But the BRICS really blocked a solution on Syria. And 2 years later, we don't know what the individual countries are doing towards the refugees, 2 million of them, 800,000 of them children, the catastrophe that's happening as a consequence of doing nothing at the Security Council. And I'm wondering for our Chinese professor if he would kindly address the strategic interests of China when it comes to twice or three times using the veto together with Russia, whereas your relationship with the GCC countries, oil, of course, is part of the strategic interest, of course. I wonder if you dismiss their concern and their anger about your position, and I'm wondering if you have really processed what does it cost you on the long run with the public, or at least half the public of the Arab region, to see you 3 times using a veto against something that they feel is not serving their interests. How do you really care at all, strategically or strictly or not strictly? Do you care?
I think China is a sovereign country. And not only a permanent member of Security Council is a sovereign country. China have independent foreign policy. China have its own, principles. And of course, often we have no, eye-to-eye disagreement on some issues with our American friends and European friends. And sometimes also, and for example, Brazil or India as a sovereign country, sometimes they can take a different position with China over issue of Syria. And the vote record in Security Council is 5 times, veto 3 times. Why veto? And I don't think that China will, in practical future, change its position. And if the Security Council resolution drafted about Syria is from assumption that this is bad guy, this is good guy, then I think in the past 3 times, China vetoed it. And in the future, we'll still veto this kind of resolution draft. But if another time, 2 times, China voted yes in Security Council, because the draft resolution have not, based on assumption, this is bad guy, this is good guy, and focus on, support Kofi Annan's mission, focus on, the efforts on political solution and the dialogue and the process. And I think, of course, and China's this kind of position is not very popular among many countries. But I don't think that in this kind of very important issue, extremely important issue, I think that China's consideration, first of all, is not popularity. And first of all is, the principle and equal, positive, and as Chinese understand.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And Tatiana, and then also Jorge, and then we have some questions back here. And I'm going to take a couple of questions very quickly, so maybe if we can start the microphone there. But Tatiana, you go first.
Yeah, 3 quick comments in reaction to this last question. First, we are very much concerned with the situation in Syria. Second, there is no single voice for BRIC countries at the UN. Third, we do not have a permanent seat at Security Council. Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Yeah, well, it's a good thing they don't. Because when they did on Libya, they abstained, together with the South Africans and the Indians. So what do you want a permanent seat for if all you do is abstain all the time? You want a permanent seat, you have to take stands. And Brazil does not want to take stands. It wants hands off. It wants to be nice and get along with everybody, which is wonderful. Stay away from the Security Council if that's what you want to do. The South
Tatiana, you don't
Africans,
have to be nice
the
yourself.
South Africans did the same thing.
China sometimes also vote abstain. I think that the
But
international
they already
situation
have a
is
seat.
very complicated.
They've had a seat for 50 years.
Vote abstain is taking a position.
They don't. The Brazilians, the Indians, and the South Africans did not take a stand on Libya. And had they been members on Syria, they would not be taking a stand because they would be inventing the same story, that the Chinese and the Russians have said, which that Libya mission creep has made it impossible for the Council now to act on Syria, which is why there is no Security Council action on Syria. If that is what they want to be members of the Security Council for, it's not worth it. And that, I think, is one of the reasons countries like Mexico and many others do not think it's a good idea for the P5 to be enlarged. Let's stick with the P5. They're the ones who have the veto. They're the ones who have been there for 60 years. And they're the ones who have a true capability, some more than others, to truly act in places like Syria, like Libya, like others.
Tatiana.
Yeah, I must respond to that, definitely. Let me say that maybe Mexico, would be willing to be there, but since there's no capability for Mexico to be there, we better stay with the 5 because it may be more convenient to stay with the 5 than to have an enlarged Security Council without Mexico. So this is something to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
Another aspect to be considered is that sometimes Brazil is a country able to build bridges, to connect some countries to others. This is a very important capacity that Brazil has been able to build, and it can be of great value. Same for Turkey, same for other countries, but this is an important capacity that Brazil has been able to build, and we are confident that this can be very useful in finding solutions that the P5 were unable to find so far.
It was especially useful with Iran and Turkey.
Okay, let's hear a couple of very quick comments here. Why don't we take 3 comments, actually 1, 2, 3, and then we'll go around.
My name is Fumiaki Kubo at the Tokyo Foundation as well as the University of Tokyo. And my question is not from Atlantic but from a Pacific Ocean perspective, which is about the TPP, addressed to Dr. Xin Hong. What do you think of the TPP? Are you suspicious that this might be an effort led by the United States to exclude Chinese economic influence, or even that it has anti-China national security implications, or rather, do you think that your government might express its intention to join the TPP in the near future eventually? Thanks.
And just briefly, for those who are on the web who don't know what TPP is.
Trans-Pacific Partnership, FTA, among the Asia-Pacific countries.
Thank you. If you can pass that down.
Patrick Worms from the World Agroforestry Center. I want to come back to the comment you made that African leaders and African youth consider agriculture to be uncool. There's a reason why they do that. That is because smallholder agriculture leads people into the classic poverty trap that's been so ably analyzed by Esther Duflo. But agricultural science has not stopped in the days of 50 or 60 years ago when the Green Revolution was first mooted. It has progressed, and agroecological principles now lead to success stories in places like Mali, Niger, Burkina, Malawi, where farm productivity increases so much that we have tantalizing signs that men are choosing to come back from the slums to the villages because the economic life they can build there is becoming more attractive than one they can make in the cities. This is bringing people out of the poverty track, and it is going to make African agriculture more productive.
Thank you. And one more point here.
Well, 2 things. I just wanted to correct Professor Castaneda because you have to consider, I'm Marcos Freitas from Brazil, that Brazil has a large Syrian population, which is Catholic Syrians, who kind of support the regime. So you have to understand that there is an internal constituency that you also need to think about. So that's something that I just wanted to emphasize from the beginning because I think there might be a mistake there. You have to understand that it is a local constituency, which is very important in Brazil because if you look into the Brazilian political environment, you see many Syrian descendants. So that's issue number 1. Now, the second thing I wanted to ask is that now that Chavez is gone, and I think that the topic is not China today, I thought it was the Atlantic. My focus is this. Now that Chavez is gone, is there any way in which Brazil and Mexico could eventually work together to be the leaders in the region? Because effectively, Brazil is a country without leaders, and also is Mexico. So how can you both work together to make sure that Latin America has one single voice? And as you negotiate with Europe and the United States, you become more effective into making this is still a Western Hemisphere century. That's my question.
Let's take the last question first then, thanks. Either Tatiana or, the last question first. About Brazil and Mexico working together.
On the Syrian constituency, I think that it's a very valid concern in many cases in Brazil and in other countries. But every country has domestic constituencies, and every country has domestic politics, especially all countries that aspire to either a regional or a world role. And although sometimes one can wonder whether the Americans, for example, are able to put their long-term national interests above the importance of the Jewish community in the United States, and one can wonder if that's the case. Nonetheless, one hopes that that would be the case. And what many people in this room, and I think elsewhere, for example, would hope is that now that President Obama is going finally to Israel and to the Middle East, he will be able to put American strategic, national, long-term interests above those right now of the Jewish community in the United States. So I think that should be worthwhile reflection. On the other question, I mean, I think, despite what Tatiana may wonder about, I think Brazil is right on the Brazilian-Mexican rivalry, and we Mexicans are wrong. Why are we wrong? Because we are the ones that who insist on having a Latin American role, and we have no role to play in South America. This is just Mexican nostalgia. We like to think about these things, Oh, there was a time when we all spoke Spanish. Of course, problem is the Brazilians speak Portuguese, but well, complicated. We don't have a role to play in South America. I think we have a very important role to play in Central America and the Caribbean, what used to be called the Caribbean Basin, together with the Americans. But Brazil is more reasonable than us, with a few silly exceptions like Honduras. But other than small metidas de pata of that sort, Brazil has been much more reasonable and not aspired to a major role in Central America or the Caribbean, and has concentrated its regional efforts in South America, which I think makes a lot of sense. So I don't think we should have a common Latin American voice. I think there are two Latin Americas, very clearly, Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean on the one hand, with one type of economic and international integration with North America, and South America with a large Brazilian influence, much more commodity exporting, much more diversified in the world in trade, investment, and everything else than we are. All of our relations, the Central Americans, the Caribbean countries, and Mexico, the rest of the world for us is called the United States, period. The rest of the stuff is stories. This is not the case for South America, not the case for Brazil. I don't know what's better or what's worse, but I do know that these are facts which are relatively rigid, which we have not really been able to modify over the last 100-odd years. And I have serious doubts that we will be able to modify them.
Tatiana, should Brazil and could Brazil?
Let me first say that I don't want to get into the specific stories of the region, etc. It's not time for that. Let me get to Marco's question. And in that sense, I would say that it's too early to say what are the consequences of Chavez's death for the region. I would say that it wasn't Venezuela that prevented Brazil and Mexico to strengthen its relations. I understand there's a new administration in Mexico. The new Mexican president went to Brazil, had a very good meeting with President Dilma, and I understand this can open new venues for strengthened cooperation between the two countries.
Yes.
TPP, yes. And the Chinese government never declared that China have suspicion about the Pan-Obama initiative to suddenly launch TPP, and such a comprehensive, free trade negotiation plan. But in China, and most of the scholars, most of the, public opinion have suspicion. does have suspicions. Why? Because, and in despite of President Obama's repeated declaration that China is America's one of the most important trade partners. China is, the American relation with the United States is most important bilateral relation the United States have in the 21st century. Have not informed the Chinese government in any degree before he launched this plan. And after that, he have not consulted with the Chinese government. And so we have plausible, as a private scholar, and we have plausible reasons to have some suspicion about not economic motivation, but some Bible strategic motivation. And also, I think that the Chinese is very firm. And anyway, and China's first objective is to push, to promote, and a more practical sub-regional economic multilateral integration plan, and especially ASEAN +1, ASEAN +3, and China, Japan, Korea, and also Chinese government even during this very intensive confrontation over Diaoyu or Senkaku, and the Chinese government and also take a positive attitude and negotiate with Japan, negotiate with and Republic of Korea for this more practical sub-regional plan. And of course, and Chinese have Chinese government have no any rights to prevent or persuade any other governments to take part in the PPP, TPP negotiation. And but of course, and the Chinese scholars and Chinese media also have some suspicion. And why Prime Minister Abe, and in despite of domestic division, especially complaints and even objections of Japanese farmers to declare a little too hurry to take part in the negotiation with the United States of Japanese membership for TPP. There is a strategic biological motivation. But China still have no any rights to interfere other people. Okay, even if TPP established, even if TPP established, and whether China decided to take part in is still China's sovereign rights. We will consider very seriously.
Thank you. Question here.
I'm John Richardson from the German Marshall Fund. One of the books which was shown up on the screen earlier is about maritime challenges in the Atlantic. It comes to a conclusion that economic activity is going to increase offshore in the maritime sphere, particularly energy and trade, and therefore shipping. But so will illegal activities, partly as a result of that. Illegal activities such as piracy, such as smuggling, drug trafficking, people trafficking, and that there is a bit of a vacuum because very few of the countries around the southern Atlantic basin have a capacity to interdict such illegal activity. It comes to the obvious conclusion that the South Atlantic countries need to cooperate on this, with increased domain surveillance, with increased Coast Guard cooperation. And such a cooperation would need leadership. One of the obvious countries to lead that would be Brazil. And so I have two questions for the panel. Would such Brazilian leadership on such a project be acceptable to the rest of the South Atlantic countries? That's for at least for two gentlemen on the left. And of course for Secretary Prazeres, would Brazil have the will to do that? And would it have the resources to put into the naval and Coast Guard capability which would be needed?
And hold off on the answer. Excuse me. I'm going to bring this here. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I'm Ana Palacio from Spain and an addict to GMF's conferences. Allow me to start by a footnote to what Jorge Castañeda said about the would-be new members of the Security Council. And I would say that in Libya there was another relevant member that abstained, it's Germany. Germany, bearing in mind that both Great Britain and France took a very clear position, and bearing in mind that we have something that is called the European Union with all of us. But this is just a footnote, and frankly I think that yes, that there is a trajectory to have an active foreign policy, and an active foreign policy means an active foreign policy, and I fully agree with you that just abstaining is not an active foreign policy in general. I've been some cases. My question, and I'm sorry that it's quite late, was about foreign investment. The world today is about foreign investment, and in particular, there is no development without foreign investment. However, before, foreign investment meant rich country, which means the United States, Europe, Japan, investing in developing countries. Today, it's not the case. Today, there is a lot of South-South investment. However, there is still the same preconceived ideas about international protection of foreign investment. We have clear cases in Latin America, not to speak of other, in Bolivia or in Argentina, and of course in Africa. I would like to see more of a debate, and especially if you allow me to make my last comment, is that China, which is a rising power, is not at all in this business of international law. It's much more on bilateral negotiations. What is the role for international law in investment protection?
Okay, we're going to stockpile. So keep in mind, I'm sorry, we're going to need short answers. We have about 8 minutes left. Just hold on one second. Yeah, sorry, one more point.
My name is Gian Giacomo Migone. I come from Italy, and Italy is a middle-sized power. Most of us are, but the difference is, as the Polish foreign minister said, some of us know it and others don't know it. So there are two ways we can go. Either we can try to move upwards to being part of the directorates, you know, or be against them when we are excluded from them and be in favor of them when we are included. And I don't think this is very useful. We could use our middle-sized privilege, or also newcomers, you know, to think if there is a common good with which, of the world, of international organizations that we want to strengthen, and that our national interest coincides, in our case, in making Europe as such stronger, the United Nations as such, and maybe start looking, rather than joining, you know, permanent membership, which we cannot do, rather look critically on the privileges of the permanent members and open a new discourse about, shall we call it, democratization of international organizations.
Good comment, and a couple of questions, if we can hit them fairly briefly. I apologize for that, and then I'm going to go to this side of the room and we'll wrap up. Did you want to go first?
Concerning this issue of leadership, and Brazil could play a role in the Southern Atlantic, but I believe that we have leaderships and not one leadership, and sure enough, Brazil could play a very important role, but I believe that also that Brazil has this challenge of understanding the past experience of, for instance, African relationship with Europe. If it doesn't understand this, there is the risk. I'm not saying that it's happening, but there is the risk that taking the same old ways leading to the same old problems. And as the expectation in Africa, as I see it, concerning Brazil, are very, very high, Brazil must understand this. Someone was speaking about agriculture. A lot of African countries are trusting on Brazil to bring technology, to bring a lot of savoir-faire, to help them with this renewal of agriculture. So, because you have on the African side, Nigeria, you have the regional entities, you have South Africa, you have Angola, you have countries that will want to play a role. Concerning the piracy issue, we go back to this issue someone raised in the beginning of environment also and development. Because if you go to the delta of Nigeria, it's not Chinese enterprise. You will find a mass on environmental agriculture, fishing, etc. It's finished. So it's not just to say China, it's a lot of company. There's concern, and that's why it's important for Africa and its relationship with China, assessing with accuracy their past experience. Concerning the foreign direct investment.
Very briefly.
Yes. I believe that all African countries is working on creating legislations and regulation that protect foreign direct investment, in spite of what you said about China.
Yes, Dr. Xi.
I think in Chinese understanding, international law generally have roughly two forms. One is that bilateral agreement between sovereign states in international law treatment, and also multilateral. And sometimes China prefer to go bilateral way because it can avoid some sophistications and complexities, and to make things more effective and more quick. But of course, China never oppose, and if there is international treaty to have some international protection of foreign direct investments. But often this is not, quick and effective. And for example, Libya, and since, shortly since the Security Council passed the American, sponsored resolution, next day, and there is war, and China have to withdraw in a very emergent basis, and 30,000 Chinese, workers and great investment. But of course, and if there is in the future, and there's internet discussion or even within the United Security Council, and China will actively participate in. But China will be prudent because China's memory and have some 19th century, record, and some international, protection of investments become imposed upon, native countries, and China will try to avoid that. And of course, and you can say China is very conservative. Yes, China is conservative.
Okay, I promise this woman one final comment, and then we'll move on.
Terry Givens, University of Texas at Austin, and I've heard a lot of, this conference is about the fragility of the global system, and I haven't heard, there's been some reference to some of the conflicts going on, but I'm wondering how some of these conflicts in Northern Africa and Africa may impact the global Atlantic, and including the fiscal crisis going on in Europe as well.
Okay, if you want to take that, Victor, very briefly.
I believe that when you speak about fragility, people tend to think about security issues, military issues, but the fragility we are living in France, in Africa, that will impact the world is poverty, is the issue of development, of disease, etc., etc. That's the huge challenge for Africa, for African countries, but also for the international community. And we see that most African countries are not going to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. First of all, it's an African problem. It's an African leadership responsibility, but it's a world challenge also because globalization is mobility, and all this situation can be translated in threats for security. So development issue is on the center of this fragility theme.
Thank you. And I just want to say that so much of what we have talked about during this entire conference has pertained to human capability and natural resources. And I would just like to say that the Brussels Forum, and I think many of you will agree, provides food for the mind, fertile ground for relationships to take root and grow, which, as we know, is key in this interconnected world, and the energy to jolt us into coming up with creative solutions to the complex problems that we're facing. Power up. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. What a great session. Thank you so much. It was really terrific.